Enslaved life and culture. In antebellum America, what did it mean to be enslaved African American, a free African American? Life in slavery. What was everyday life like for enslaved African Americans in the South? In the rural South, the main staple crop grown was cotton. Northern shippers depended on the profits from the cotton trade with Europe, and the cotton industry greatly expanded during the early 1800s. By 1840, cotton accounted for nearly half of all U.S. exports, and the South produced more than half of the world's supply of cotton. As a result, the men who owned the land where cotton was grown held a powerful influence over the U.S. economy. The intensive work of growing cotton relied on the labor of enslaved African Americans. They cleared the land, planted the seeds, picked the cotton, and cleaned the cotton fibers by removing the seeds, all by hand. As landowners in the South gained more profits from the cotton industry, they bought more enslaved people to work the land. Because these men were brought and women were brought wealth to landowners, not only for the work they did, but also their value in the slave market. They were treated as investments in property. Enslaved people were bought and sold at auctions, and families were separated for economic reasons, such as when the landowner's property was divided among his heirs or if he went bankrupt. Because the business people involved in the cotton industry viewed enslaved people as assets or valuable things that could be owned, they were not granted the democratic freedoms of citizens. Instead, the majority of enslaved people spent their lives on farms, performing manual labor that contributed to the economic success of the landowner and his family. Slavery on plantations. The majority of enslaved people in the South worked on large farms called plantations, which were dependent on slave labor to function. Field hands worked from dawn till dusk, 6 days a week, doing all the hard labor, including clearing land, planting, and weeding. During harvest season, enslaved people might work 18-hour days. No one was exempt from working, even pregnant women or children. Children as young as 3 or 4 years of age weeded gardens, carried drinking water, and helped care for the animals. Enslaved people who were elderly or disabled were nonetheless required to work unceasingly, doing whatever tasks they were capable of. For example, people who were unable to walk or stand might be forced to weave cloth or sew or mend clothes. Field work was not just brute labor. Skill and effort were also needed to grow cotton, rice, and tobacco, as well as to care for horses and other livestock. Other enslaved people became skilled bricklayers, carpenters, coopers, or smiths. Field workers were under the watchful eye of the overseer, a white man whose job was to get the most work possible out of the enslaved laborers. Sometimes the overseers were cruel and used harsh treatment. However, enslaved people were considered valuable property. If they complained of cruel treatment, an owner would sometimes replace the overseer. Enslaved people who disobeyed or tried to escape, however, were treated harshly. Whipping was a common form of punishment. Sometimes those who rebelled could be sold to a new owner who resided far away, separating them from their families. On plantations, enslaved people lived in separate quarters from the plantation owners. Usually enslaved people resided in simple shacks with dirt floors. They were poorly fed. Infants and children in particular did not receive proper nutrition. Many suffered from diseases caused by malnutrition. These include rickets, a vitamin D or mineral deficiency that causes pain and weak bones, and scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that causes muscle weakness. As a result of malnutrition and other health issues, perhaps a third of all babies born into enslavement died before they were a year old, and hardly more than half lived to their 10th birthday. Malnutrition of enslaved persons was largely due to ignorance. Slave owners wanted slave babies to grow strong and healthy so they could be good workers. Not all enslaved people worked outdoors in the fields. Some enslaved laborers worked in the plantation owner's house. They cooked, cleaned, served as maids or waiters, did the laundry, and cared for the plantation owner's children. Living conditions for enslaved people in the house was better than that of field hands, and they usually received better food. Slave codes. Most states had laws called slave codes that explained the rights of slave owners. The codes varied from state to state, but there were many similarities. Under these codes, it was forbidden to teach an enslaved person to read and write. Enslaved people could not meet in groups without a white person present. An enslaved person could not keep a gun. Enslaved people could not give testimony against white people in court. For the most part, enslaved people were treated as possessions. They could be sold, passed on to heirs, or given as gifts. Some slave codes restricted harsh beatings and made it illegal to kill an enslaved person, but these legal protections were almost never enforced. Family life. What was family life like for enslaved people? Enslaved people could not marry without the owner's permission, and slave marriages were not recognized by law. Despite this, many enslaved people formed marriage-like partnerships, and some were able to live with the same spouse for their whole lives. However, owners could sell off wives or husband at any time, and it was not uncommon for a wife and husband to be forced to live apart. Owners used breaking up families as a threat and a punishment. If an enslaved husband and wife or an enslaved parent and child were lucky enough to live within a few miles of each other, they might be able to obtain special permission from their owners to visit one another. And in general, plantation owners accepted slave marriages because they thought married enslaved people were less likely to try to run away. Despite these restrictions, many enslaved families developed strong bonds. Parents often named children for family members and kept in touch with kin on neighboring plantations. When parents were absent, aunt, uncles, or cousins cared for children. Children were frequently sold off from their parents. If a child was sold to a neighboring plantation, relatives on the plantation would often take on the role of parent. If a blood relative was not present, another family would often try to substitute for the parents. Many children were taught to refer to all enslaved adults other than their parents as aunt or uncle, and to call other enslaved children their brothers and sisters. And this way, a strong sense of community developed among enslaved African Americans. Religion. You might wonder how human beings could survive living in such conditions. For enslaved Americans, religious and cultural traditions played a large part in helping them cope with the harshness of their lives. Slave owners encouraged religion as a means of control. They commonly forced enslaved people to attend services where white ministers preached the values of obedience and of accepting one's lot in life. However, many enslaved African Americans also developed their own religious practices. These often blended traditional African and Christian rituals. Prayers, hymns, and sermons often focused on eventual release from bondage and escape to the promised land. Songs and stories. Music also served as an important part of the culture of enslaved African Americans. The most important instrument was the voice, often accompanied by clapping or foot stomping. Enslaved people also made drums, rattles, and stringed instruments such as a banjo. Work songs helped make group tasks go more smoothly. American jazz, gospel, and blues music developed as spirited responses to the drudgery and suffering that characterized the daily lives of enslaved African Americans. Enslaved people also entertained each other with storytelling. Very few enslaved people learned to read because it was illegal to teach them. Traditions, stories, and songs were passed along orally, that is, by word of mouth. Folktales such as the Brer Rabbit stories bred the value of cleverness. These stories, based on African trickster tales, taught African American children and adults how to survive with dignity in a dangerous world.